Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer. I'm the General Manager of BrushyMtnBeeFarm. I'd like to welcome you all this evening to Crazy Ideas, and we'll probably have some crazy stories along the way. To give you a little bit of background about how we came to be here tonight with this title and this particular topic, I was giving a talk at a local association a couple weeks ago, months ago, whatever, and we had a lot of really great tangents that we went on about things that people were doing that weren't quite mainstream. And it was really entertaining to hear about all these different things, and so I thought, gosh, that's a great topic for a talk. And so here we are. There's also all kinds of things that we've heard over the years about crazy things beekeepers do, not necessarily crazy experiments, which is what we're going to kind of focus on here this evening, but just things that happen, such as, trying to capture a swarm when it's directly overhead and all the bees end up falling on top of you, to, in this case, this is a scene from How I Met Your Mother, but it reminds me of a time that I saw a beekeeper come into the office one day and had a chard mark in some places that you wouldn't want necessarily to see chard marks. I'll let you leave your imagination go there. And what happened was he held the smoker a little too close, and it was a little too hot, and actually caught the coveralls on fire. Now, that's not this picture again, but we do some pretty crazy things in beekeeping. And of course, as the hobby, working with stinging insects, it's ripe for bloopers and blunders, and I'm sure we've all made our fair share of them. I certainly have, and I'm sure I'll make numerous others as we go forward in my career. But tonight I want to focus on some things that we do as beekeepers that are sort of novel, that are kind of fun experiments, that really lead to some unique results. And for me, this is really where some real excitement lies in beekeeping. Sort of playing around with the bees and seeing how they respond. One of the things we do here at the business, we've got hives at the business. We don't really do much with those hives. We get some honey off of them, but really what we use them for are experimentations, testing new product, testing new techniques, and so they're constantly being manipulated. They don't produce much honey to begin with as a result, but really that's the fun of beekeeping. And so if you've been doing this for a while, if you're brand new this year, probably not the best idea to start manipulating and experimenting with your hive. Get some of the basic beekeeping under your belt before you do that. But once you've gotten a little bit of knowledge under your belt, try some different things. Experiment a little bit. See how things go. Maybe things work out really well. Maybe things don't work out really well. That's how we come up with some really great, interesting results. Some of the products that we carry in our catalog are the results of inquisitive, experimentally minded individuals that tried some things, and as a result, a product was born. Most recently added to our catalog was the Overland Nuke Wintering Board, which was brought to us by Overland Honey in Maine. It's a board used for overwintering nukes, and they were just experimenting with that. And overwintering nukes is not a new concept. It's been around for a while, and people have tried different techniques, some which worked great, others which didn't. And this is one that worked well for them, and so they brought the idea to us. But that's how this happens, is that experimentation, that asking yourself, what if I try this? And so that we'll explore a little bit of that here this evening, and I'll sort of pause along the way. It's a very casual, informal topic, right? So I'll pause along the way for some questions rather than holding them all to the end, because I don't have a full hours-long presentation here. So we've got some time to have some conversation, and I hope you enjoy the topic. So crazy ideas. Certainly, if we get, if I can get my presentation here to advance, if we look at, there we go, right? Some of the tried and true things, the bee beard, the bee contests, the bee bikini has become popular. That's actually a photo from a sci-fi station where they were doing some commercial or I don't know what it was, but some bee bikini. The one there on the left where the person's completely covered, this was in preparation to try and break the world's record for having the most bees on you at any one time. And this seems like there's at least one of those events each year where someone tries to break the record. And then, of course, the tried and true bee beard, right? So these are some of the things that would typically maybe come to mind in terms of bee experiments. And they're fun, they're novel, right? They're good PR. It makes us beekeepers look that much wackier in the eyes of the non-beekeeping world. But really, what benefit do these have for us as beekeepers? There's really not much. And then, of course, there's some of those really unusual things. The donkey, this photo made its round the internet probably a year or two ago. This beekeeper that suits up his donkey and people suiting up their dog to go into bee hives so they don't get stung. Again, curious, fun, comical stuff, but doesn't really benefit us as beekeepers. And so let's start looking at some things that do. And so we've got infused honey, and this, if you remember when you registered for this, I asked you, what things have you done? And one person wrote in, I fed my bees Mountain Dew to have Mountain Dew flavored honey, so infused honey. Now these are things that I might not necessarily suggest, and what I've got here, these pictures, these are a result not of intentionally infusing honey, but rather accidentally infusing honey. The one with the frame of red honey that looks like blood dripping out of it, that was taken in the New York City area, and the bees were visiting a maraschino cherry factory nearby this beekeeper and bringing back that sugary liquid to the hive and storing it. And as a result, he got this maraschino cherry quote-unquote honey in his frames in this blood red material. And of course you can imagine it took a little bit to figure out what that was initially. Probably a little bit horrifying the first time you saw it. But so you can, that sort of infused honey. And these other pictures are more recent. I think it was probably about a month or two ago. We heard reports of blue honey, and you can see it in the cells there where it almost looks like pollen. It's so thick and translucent, or rather opaque. And so we have this blue honey, and you can see the picture of the brown, the blue, the green. And it turned out that these were bees going to an M&M factory nearby and bringing back the colored sugary material that was being used in the production of M&Ms. Now again, people are certainly doing this intentionally to come up with an infused product, if you will. And I have in quotes honey because it's not really honey, right? That's maraschino cherry juice. It's not really honey that bees have produced, but they've stored it in our frames. But there are cases where people are, in fact, feeding very small doses of flavored syrup to just add a very subtle flavor to their product. As the bees are consuming that syrup and storing it in the frames. Now these again are accidental cases. Probably the more appropriate way, if you wanted to sort of infuse real honey, not what we've got here, would be do it after you've harvested. And this has really taken off over the past several years. Of course, there's all sorts of honey products out there, honey barbecue sauce, but now people are taking honey and rather using it as an ingredient, actually taking other things and putting it in the honey as ingredients. So cinnamon honey, chocolate honey. There's all sorts of cases where people take freeze-dried powder and get cranberry, blueberry, orange, mango, all these things, all these freeze-dried powdered, and make a honey, a flavored honey product. That's the more appropriate way. Again, interesting, kind of fun, but not really much benefit to us as beekeepers. Certainly the infused honey, that's a real growing niche market, and as beekeepers we could definitely benefit from that if we're in an area where there's a bit of demand for that. But this right here, what I'm showing you, just by accident happened which has led to other people sort of trying to do it intentionally. There's also this new thing going on. It was EAS, Eastern Apiculture Society. I think it was it last year, where there was a sculpture made from beeswax. Now, we've seen sculptures made from a solid block of beeswax where they sort of chisel the sculpture out of that solid block. But what I'm referring to here is the bees actually do the sculpting. And so just recently, doers came out with a video that showed these two pictures on the left, where they took a bottle that was inside this plastic shell that you can see there, and those are bees inside there. And the bees drew comb on that form that was inside this plastic case, and you ended up with a bottle-shaped honeycomb. So the bees actually did the sculpting. This is not something that the beekeeper took a solid chunk of wax and shaped. Rather, the bees did this. Certainly the form was provided, but the bees actually drew the wax on that form. And you can get really creative, right? So there's a vase where someone's had the bees draw the comb on a vase. I don't know whether this is hollow. You could probably create a situation where the bees formed an actual vase that's beeswax, right? So it's fat, it repels water. Maybe it would hold water. I don't know. It'd be really interesting. So all sorts of creative things. And at the Eastern Apiculture Society, there were some really elaborate versions of this. And you can see this one isn't very attractive. They didn't finish it, but you can see here this particular person took some, it's obviously crimped wire foundation, and spliced it together, cut it up and spliced it together to create an interesting pattern, put this on top of a hive and let the bees draw comb on it to create this interesting pattern. And you can actually see some brood that's down in there towards the bottom, and the bees have obviously been taken off of this, but sort of this using the bees to create sculptures, to create art. And this is, again, fun, kind of novel, interesting, but really as us novice beekeepers, we're probably not going to be doing this. We're probably not going to be benefiting from it. But what we can do is we can use this as inspiration and let our creativity sort of run wild. And here's something that actually people have been doing that does have benefit for us. It creates a product which we can market. So these are jars, and I've actually done this. These are not my pictures, unfortunately. I didn't take pictures of my setup, but you take jars and you put you take a sheet of plywood and you drill holes in them that the jar, the neck of the jar fits down into. And you put that plywood on top of a hive, and you put an empty box around it, and you put the lid on. And the bees go up into the jars, and they draw comb. They begin to actually draw comb inside the jars, and you can see on the right here the result of that, where the bees have gone in there, they've drawn comb, they've stored honey, they've capped that honey, and sometimes the beekeeper will top the jar off with liquid honey, so it's a form of chunk honey, if you will. Other times they'll leave it just like this, where it's plain. And actually, when I was down in Argentina several years ago, I got a jar of this where the beekeeper had the bees go into the jar. They drew the comb right in there. There was no liquid honey. It was just the comb. They had a very nice package, as this is, right? A little wooden base with a wooden spoon and some raffia there with the tag to market this product. It was a very nice presentation. This is definitely sort of a niche market, something that would do well in sort of health food gourmet stores. Something like this probably isn't going to do well at your local grocery store on the shelf there. Maybe some farmers markets, but probably your best bet would be sort of the health food store where people are looking for that really sort of unique, novel health product, which this certainly is, right? This is completely created by the bees. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is sometimes the bees don't like to go up into these jars, and they don't like to start drawing the comb. They're a little resistant. So just like any type of comb honey that you're producing, whether it be this or Ross rounds or cut comb or anything else, you have to have a good strong colony, and you've got to have a really great nectar flow where they want to build comb and they want to store honey in it. One of the things that you can do to sort of entice the bees in there and also create some interesting patterns as well is you can take some cut comb foundation and actually glue it with a little bit of melted wax, or just simply stick it if it's warm enough to the what would be the bottom of the jar, but in this case the top, right? So that little piece of the strip, so it's a starter strip basically for the bees to begin working. So you stick that to the glass, and those bees will go up in there and they'll start using that starter strip as a point to begin their wax construction. And depending on the shape of that starter strip will dictate a little bit the shape of the comb in which they build inside this jar. So the jar that I referenced earlier that I brought back from Argentina, it was actually a plus that they had put in the jar, and so inside the jar, the finished product was also a plus of drawn comb. So it was a really interesting shape, and the bees had attached the edges, I guess the points, if you will, of that plus to the inside surface of the jar. And so you had these really nice sort of convolutions with points of contact and another convolution, little concave area where you could see the capped honey. It's really, really beautiful. So you can use sort of that sculpting philosophy or technique as inspiration to do something like this that produces a product which you can sell. We can also take sculpting one step further, and this is probably more of a novelty that won't really appeal to a lot of the people listening, but depending on where you are, this could be really interesting. So you take a frame of honey like this one, capped honey, and again, this requires, all these things sort of require a nectar flow, a good strong colony, but you take a frame of honey like this that's basically ready to be harvested, right? If we saw that in our hives, we'd be thinking, great, look at that beautiful layer of cappings, nice and white, just the way we like it. That's going to make some beautiful candles or lip balms or whatever it is we're going to do with it. And that honey underneath looks really nice and light as well, so I'm really looking forward to some nice extracted honey. But that's not what we're going to do with this frame. And if we had a frame kind of like this, we could do something similar. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to use a knife or something like that to carve into those cappings. So we're going to break some cells open, and what we get is a pattern. And so again, this was a picture taken down at the Apimundia conference in Argentina that was 3 years ago, where this was the name of a company or organization, I can't remember, or abbreviation for such, where they did just that. They had a frame of capped honey, and they went in and they cut those cells open, and what happened was, of course, that exposed the honey. Well, now here, because it's a good nectar flow, and they provided a little bit of extra space between this frame and the adjacent frame. We've seen this in our colonies. If you've worked your colony before, you've probably seen not necessarily a created pattern like this, but we've seen where bees will draw honey out, comb out much further when they're putting honey in it, because they can store more. So in this case, they've carved these initials, these letters, into the comb, the capped comb, broken those cells open, so the bees have come in, they've cleaned that up, and now they've created additional space for those bees to draw those cells out that much further and continuing to store surplus honey in them. And the reason why this pattern is created is because we start with a frame that is essentially capped or fairly close to being capped, and so they don't work any of these other cells along the top or bottom or through between the letters, because those are already sealed. They don't uncap those, but since we go through and uncap these cells, those are the ones that continue to be drawn out, so they rise up off the surface of the frame. Now keep in mind, you can do some really interesting things. You can write your name, you can put your business, might be a nice display at your farmer's market table, or maybe you could create a nice display case if you're in sort of a gourmet health food store. I could put on, carve in there, Shane's honey. And I could put that in a display case. It would be on the top shelf with all my honey and goodies that I'm selling below at this gourmet health food store or at my farmer's market table. Now just keep in mind, we can't get high resolution here, right? We're talking, what, maybe 5 DPI, 5 cells per inch. So the resolution is not very good. So of course keep that in mind when you're planning on this. But this is a really nice thing that would attract attention to your product if you're selling them, and something fairly easy to do. And of course then once you've got it, once you've made this, or actually once the bees have made this, you just have to take care to handle it cautiously so that you don't damage this this nice pretty frame. And you can see that this one has a little bit of damage on some of the cells here. Those cells have been broken open. But once you've got it, you can keep it for a while and make sure that it's in good shape when you go out to these venues if you're transporting it. So that's a really interesting twist on sort of sculpting. A little bit different. Here we're using a honey frame rather than the bees sort of sculpting with wax. I see that, let's see, anybody, I don't see any questions coming in just yet. Some people have raised their hands, which I can't really work with that. But if you have any questions, you can feel free to type those in, and we'll try and take those as they come in. I'm going to keep on going here. There we go. And so we all know that Varroa is public enemy #1 for beekeepers, right? So this is the bane of our beekeeping career. It causes problems with disease and viruses. It weakens our colony. It's one of the leading causes of colony mortality. And so wouldn't it be nice if we had some way of dealing with Varroa that's also a little bit fun, not too labor intensive, that doesn't require adding a medicated strip or a miticide of some sort. And wouldn't that be great? Well, several years ago, this was a great little experiment. I was at a meeting where a researcher said, I don't have time to do this, but I think that this really has some potential. Wouldn't it be interesting if we took 2 hives, 2 queen-right colonies, put them together, put a queen excluder straddling both and some supers on top, and so look to see what happened. Look to see if we got increased honey production. And then also under these wings, let me advance. So here's what we've got. We've got a little bit of a close-up. You can see here's one colony, here's another, and this is a plastic queen excluder. And notice how level these hives are, so that this queen excluder fits tight against this edge of the box and tight against this edge of the box, and then just some fabricated migratory nuke tops, essentially, that cover up the wings here. So what we've got are 2 colonies feeding 1 stack of supers with these migratory covers covering up the remaining portion of the hive, and then inside we've got a drone frame. You may recognize that green frame as a drone frame. And so here we've got the ability, without unstacking all our supers, right? Because in summertime, this time of year, when our bees are foraging for nectar and they're producing honey, hopefully, which it seems for the most part they are, the supers can get stacked up quite high, and they're heavy. There's no doubt about it. And it's disruptive to unstack those, get into the brood chamber, take out the drone frame, and restack. But in this configuration, in the tower configuration, you have 2 colonies pushed together, feeding 1 stack of supers, and you've got the green drone frame easily accessible underneath that nuke migratory cover. Now in this case, it's in a little bit further. I'd probably pull it back closer to the outside, but this is sort of an experiment. And what's nice about this is, of course, you can easily pull that drone frame out and it's green to identify it as a drone frame. You can see this one's all drawn comb on this. And also, if that frame were out of the way, I could also kind of go in underneath the stack of supers and sort of draw some frames to the outside and actually do a pretty thorough inspection of the brood chamber within that top box. So here we've got a situation where we've got 2 colonies feeding 1 stack of supers, so essentially a 2-queen colony, more or less, feeding a single stack of supers, which sometimes results in an increased honey production, not if we looked at them individually. So the sum of these 2 in this configuration would oftentimes result in more honey than 2 individual hives functioning independent of one another if we looked at the total honey that they produced. And we have access to this drone frame. And as we know, maybe we don't know, but we know that mites gravitate towards drones. One of the reasons why they gravitate towards drones is because on their native host, that's what they go after, whereas with European honeybees, they're less discriminating. They'll go after worker cells as well as drone cells, but they definitely gravitate towards the drones. And from a beekeeper's perspective, the mites that go into a drone cell result in a higher reproductive rate than those mites that go into a worker cell, because the drone cell's capped longer. So if we can identify in our colonies where these bees are drawing drone comb and where they're raising drones, and then use this as a trap, we can reduce our mite population. And so here's one of those frames that has been drawn out and now is ready to go into a freezer. The mites are sealed in those caps, so we can freeze this for 48 hours or keep it in there for roughly 21 days while there's another frame inside the hive. Or we can also take this and sort of hold it at arm's length at an angle, hit it with a garden hose, you shear the cappings off and flush out the drone pupa as well as the mites. So here's a fun little experiment that was thrown off the cuff by someone giving a talk, which spawned this little experiment, and actually yielded some really interesting results. So this is a graph from some of from that experiment, and you can see that this normal, the dark squares, and this is Varroa mites falling per day. As we approached into September, right, and August and September, when mite populations typically hit their maximum, and sure enough, we can see here that they're spiking up exponentially. So here we're looking at, what is that, maybe 25, 26, 27 or so mites in a quote-unquote normal colony, but then in colonies with the tower configuration, we're down at maybe 7, a little bit less than 7 mites per day. So we've dramatically reduced our Varroa population within this colony by simply pushing these 2 together and having them feeding a common stack of supers. So this is a fun little experiment that's made beekeeping a little bit easier, has some real benefit for us as beekeepers, because now we can use an IPM technique, drone trapping or Varroa trapping, depending on how you want to refer to it, to reduce our Varroa population, maybe get a little bit of extra honey off of these colonies, because we've got these 2 colonies feeding a single stack of supers, so there's increased efficiency in trying to cure that honey, cap that honey, etc., because we've got these 2 colonies feeding into it. But most importantly, we've really impacted the health of our colony by reducing the Varroa population. So here's a fun little experiment that you can try as a beekeeper. You just need 2 colonies in close proximity together, so you can push them together to try this out. So that's actually all I've got this evening. We've got 3 sort of experiments that we can try. Of course, other new novel things that we can do if you want to take up a bee beard or anything like that. But we've got some 3 tips ideas that could be tried, the jars, the sculpting of a frame, and this tower configuration. Of course, there's lots of others out there, good ideas and bad ideas. The limit is just up to your curiosity and your ingenuity. And so with that, I'll open it up to any questions. If you have any questions, there should be a panel on the right side where you can type in your question. Raising your hand, I can't respond to that, but if you type in your question, I'll certainly read those out and then try and give the answer. So one question coming in regarding the tower configuration. What happens if one side goes queenless? And also, are there any problems with queens fighting? Well, the answer to that is that, one, the queens can't fight because, let me go back up to that picture, because they can't get to each other. So that's the purpose of the queen excluder. And the reason why I mentioned specifically that this was a plastic one, you could use a metal one as well, but you cannot use a wood-bound queen excluder because that would leave a gap. But these plastic or metal sit flush on the tops here, so the queens can't jump across. And in terms of the bees fighting, they don't. The bees that are inside these colonies are not doing battle with one another. They're perfectly fine being in close proximity and serving the same stack of supers, and they don't have an issue with that. In terms of what happens if one hive goes queenless, that can be a bit of an issue because you do get enough pheromone drift from your queen right colony over to your queenless colony. So they, in our case when we did this, we did have a few that went queenless. They did not attempt to raise out a new queen. They didn't build supersedure cells. They didn't build emergency cells. They did not requeen themselves. But one thing that was interesting is that the queen right colony, a lot of the worker bees did go over to the queenless colony as the population diminished to sort of maintain that comb and deterred wax moth and hive beetle and things like that from entering into that colony. So if you have one going queenless, you'd have to separate these two to repopulate that queenless or requeen that queenless hive. Let's see. Has anyone tried splitting on their queen and direct releasing her into a queenless hive? Has anyone tried splitting on their queen and direct releasing her into a queenless hive? So I assume that direct releasing her, we're direct releasing the new queen. Oftentimes that won't go well if they haven't had a chance to realize that they're queenless. If you direct release her. But the interesting thing is, if you leave a colony queenless, if you do that, if you make the split and leave your colony queenless for anything more than 24 hours, they'll start to raise out emergency queen cells if they can. And so when you then install your new queen, it's often a good idea to go through and try and find those cells that they're raising out and get rid of them. That's one of the reasons why when you install a new queen, sort of having that time release capsule with the sugar plug is a good idea. Can ants get into your hives? Can ants get into your hives? Should you try to get rid of ants? Do they really hurt anything? I see hives that are only setting on pallets. So in this case, these were just on pallets. Ants can be a bit of a nuisance. I've never really seen ants be a problem to the colony itself. Where I've seen the ants are up on the inner covers. And boy, they can really make a mess of it. They'll lay eggs up there, and you'll just see a big old mound of ant eggs in there. So some things that beekeepers have done to try and deal with ants, and here's some experiments you can try. Someone, and I don't have a problem with ants, so I've yet to try this experiment. Someone once told me that if you take a twig from an apple tree with the leaves on it and set it on your inner cover, that it'll deter ants. There's something about the almond extract that's in there. There's a little bit of benzaldehyde that's in the leaves that will deter ants. Very low levels. Now, I haven't tried this myself. Also, a little bit of cinnamon up there will deter ants, or around the base of the hive. I've heard that deters ants as well. So you can try those. I meant splitting on the queen to mask the. Oh, spitting. I'm sorry. I missed. Oh, this goes back to that split. That question that came up. I misread the question. It's not splitting on the queen, but rather spitting on the queen and direct releasing her. So I've heard this one as well. This can be a bit of a costly experiment if you want to try it, but there are numerous reports. A lot of people have told me that you take your queen and you spit on her, and your saliva will mask the pheromone of the queen and give her a long enough time basically in that colony that as that pheromone slowly becomes unmasked, if you will, at that point they will have accepted her. I have not tried this myself, but I have heard from several beekeepers that it does work. And so the next step, I guess, in all of this is people are going to have to try these things and report back. So the person that asked the question about the ants, you'll have to try putting an apple, a twig from an apple tree on the inner cover, and someone's going to have to try spitting on a queen and direct releasing her into a queenless hive to see whether they accept her or not. So here's someone that has reported back, I assume that this is on the spitting, that I did it and it worked in 2 hives. So apparently there's, it does work, or at least it did for this beekeeper. So there's some first-hand information on spitting on your queen. I would just be careful, I guess, depending on how generous you are with the spit. But give it a go. So we've got a couple other questions. Here's someone saying the cinnamon for first-year beekeeper did not work in deterring ants. When winter, here's another experiment. When the winter temperatures remain extremely low for long periods, has anyone had any luck with kicking and banging on the side of the hive to break up the cluster so that it moves into honey stores? That one I haven't heard before. I would be a little reluctant depending on the temperatures. If it's really cold, we're talking, down below freezing, single digits, low teens, I would not suggest that, because you could actually, if you've ever had a frame of bees, or let's think of a package of bees. Most of us at some point have installed a package of bees, or at least seen a package installed, and how the bees hang from the top of the package or swarm hanging off a branch. It doesn't take much jarring to break that cluster loose. Now, in the hive, it's not quite as extreme, right? You don't have all the bees hanging off the bees that are clinging to the top of the package. You've got numerous bees clinging to the surfaces of the frame, and less bees that are suspended off of them. But I would still be concerned that if you hit that hive and jarred it, that you would actually dislodge some bees, and that they would be so chilled they would not be able to recluster. And that's one of the problems that we see with temperature fluctuations, where the cluster gets loose and then you get a sudden drop in temperature as a cold front comes through, and sometimes that cluster doesn't have an opportunity to reform sufficiently, and that's when you actually get some bees that freeze. What you could try this, but I would wait until, or only do it when temperatures are sort of marginal, maybe down sort of in that freezing range, low 40s, where that cluster may be loosening a little bit, and so you're sort of agitating those bees, getting them walking around. You can hear them roaring around. They're agitated, they're moving, and they'll sort of settle back down on a new source of honey. But if it were really cold, I'd be nervous about doing that. But you can certainly give it a go. Let's see, any other questions? We don't have, this is the first time ever that I've had an empty question panel. So we still have, whoa, here comes one. We still have a little bit of time, so if you have questions about anything else, feel free to type them in, and we'll do a quick Q&A on beekeeping in general. So I put a 3-inch by 12-inch piece of plexiglass, smeared Crisco with sugar and some drops of wintergreen on it, and place it on the bottom board through the bees will walk through when they enter. Weeks later, when I pull it out, many wax moth larvae under the plexiglass experiment was a do. So this is, I guess, for wax moth, attracting the wax moth down there. Certainly, sort of that Crisco and sugar and the wintergreen. That combination has been used for tracheal mites for years. I've never heard it used for wax moth, though, so that's interesting. The orange thing that you see here, that's just a plug that I used to seal an upper entrance. It was a dud. The experiment about the wax moth was a dud, not a do. Do you think drumming will cause a swarm high in a tree to come down to a bait hive? So regarding drumming, for those of you that aren't aware, if you see a swarm, the tail goes, and I'll call it a tail, not because I don't think it's true, but just because that's probably the best way to just refer to it. That if you beat on a pot with a wooden spoon or just make a ruckus, that the swarm will drop to the ground and then can be easily caught in a bait hive, as the case is here. I've heard this referred to more often than not when the swarm is in flight, not actually clustered to a branch or hanging in that clustered form. So I don't know if they would drop out of a tree and come down to a bait hive, but I have heard people dropping a swarm out of air as it's getting ready to disperse, or perhaps first forming on that branch, but never when they're sort of in that clustered form, waiting until they go to their new home. And this is one that's sort of real sporadic in reliability, I'll say. I have some people that swear it's true, that they've done it, it's worked, it's a proven technique for dropping a swarm out of the air, and then other people that say the complete opposite. So it could be perhaps that it's a matter of timing. Those people that got it to work timed it just right at a stage of swarming when it was conducive for that technique to work, whereas those people that it didn't work for, maybe the swarm was already committed to leaving, and no matter what they did, they weren't going to stop it. I'm not sure. The jury's really still out on the drumming as a technique to catch swarms. When you open up your hive and see bees clinging together in a bridge formation, does this mean your hive is queenless? Not usually, no. When they're sort of bridging across, when they're, I assume you sort of mean between frames, that they're sort of like if you sort of slowly separated two frames, they would form a bridge between those two frames. That's often a case when they're building wax. They'll sort of cling together, pass wax flakes to one another to draw comb, to seal honey, whatever the case may be. But that's not necessarily an indication of queenlessness. So in colder climates, is there any reason not to move hives to a warm location that's partially heated? Actually, up in Canada, I went to an outfit up there where they have wintering houses. And I forget the number of hives that each house holds. It's something like, it's a commercial beekeeping operation. And I want to say each wintering house held about 1,000 colonies. So in that case, what they're doing is, yes, they're bringing them into a climate-controlled environment where the temperatures don't fluctuate, where they're held stable so that the bees are sort of at that happy medium where that cluster can easily move around the colony to get to new honey stores, but yet not so active that they're coming and going and flying. The hazard that they've got, because there's so many colonies in this area, so many bees in this room, and they're packed in there so tightly, they actually have to have air exchange because the bees are in there breathing, producing carbon dioxide, so they do have to bring in some fresh air to exchange out. So depending on where, I suspect you're not in that situation. You might just have a hive or two in a garage, perhaps, where it's a little bit more tempered from temperature fluctuations. The thing you've got to be cautious of here is if you can't regulate the temperature in that facility, in that garage or shed or whatever the case may be, and it gets warm enough that they begin to fly, what's going to happen then? Do they have an escape route to the outdoors, or are you going to have a garage filled with bees that have come out and are now bouncing off the window because they're going to the light? So that's a hazard you've got to be aware of and try and mitigate. Let's see here. Bees won't draw out comb after adding an excluder. Any suggestions? The question that I would ask you is the frames that are above the queen excluder, are they brand new frames and foundation? I have found that adding a queen excluder and putting a box of brand new frames and foundation above that queen excluder is not enticing enough for the bees to go through the excluder. But if you take that queen excluder out, let them go up there, begin to draw comb, store a little bit of honey, maybe the queen lays a few eggs, and then slip that queen excluder back in, just make sure your queen's below it, that now those bees will readily pass through the queen excluder and begin to utilize those frames. So I don't know if that's the case or not. Even if they're not brand new frames and foundation, you can still take that queen excluder out, let them have free passage, and then insert it after that once they're working those frames. You can also pull a frame up from the brood chamber if you're using the same sized equipment in your brood chamber as you are your honey supers. So if you have frames that are infested with small hive beetle or wax moth, can you safely reuse those frames, or should you destroy them? I'm not sure if you're making the distinction here or not, but I'll make the distinction between foundation, between the comb and the frames. Typically, comb, which has been infested with wax moth or small hive beetle larvae, the bees will never clean that up. They won't touch it unless it's a real mild case of wax moth. I've never seen them clean up hive beetle goo, slime. So in that case, you can cut the comb out of the frame and certainly clean the frame up and reuse the frame, yes. But reuse the comb, probably not. Let's see. So a couple people just adding a little clarity that the bridging is called festooning. That's when the bees sort of hang together to build the wax. Is there a problem with moving hives around in the bee yard or locations that are nearby? Typically, the rule of thumb is if you move a hive, you want to move it 2 miles or more so that your foraging bees won't go back to the original location. Typically, your foragers will travel about a 2-mile area. And so if you move your hive 2 miles, those forager bees reorient on its new location. They don't go back to the old location. Now, if you move your hive a foot to one side or the other, that's not a problem. But if you move it 100 feet, that could be a problem. The bees will go back to the old location and look for their hive, and of course it won't be there. There is a little trick that works actually quite well. I have done this one. I had to do this one once. I had to move some hives to a new location on our property. We were getting married and had to relocate them. And what you do is you move the hive, let's say 100 feet, and you do this at night, and you pack the entrance with brush. Now, when I say pack the entrance, I'm not saying you seal the entrance with brush, but you sort of layer the entrance with brush so that when the bees come out the next morning, they literally have to walk and crawl their way through this several inches of brush that's now in front of the hive. And what that does is it signifies such a drastic change in their leaving the hive that they reorient now. They think they're tricked into thinking that they're in a new location. So they reorient on that new location. And then what happens is over the course of a week or two, slowly a couple pieces a day, you remove that brush so that it's no longer in front of the hive and everything's just fine and dandy. So let's see. So this goes back to trying to get the bees up into a super with a queen excluder. Can you spray the frames with some with some sugar or something like that to get them to draw comb? Yeah, you sure can. You can take a sugar water solution, spray them down. They'll get up there. They'll start licking that up and cleaning up the frames, and before you know it, they usually start drawing out comb. The other thing that may be influencing whether they're drawing comb or not is, of course, whether you've got a nectar flow. No nectar flow, they won't draw comb. Now, right now, this time of year, most places are having a nectar flow. Even we are here right now. Sourwood's just begun. Not sure if they're working it yet or not, but we still have some clover blooming, and this is sometimes a bad time of year for us. So they should be able to draw some comb now. Let's see. Couple questions. Wrapping the hive for extreme cold. A lot of people use black tar paper for this. It's relatively inexpensive. You can pick it up at a hardware store, and the black plastic or the black tar paper absorbs the heat and transfers a little bit of that to the colony. So you can certainly wrap your colonies. Has anyone tried making homemade honeybee healthy? Our beekeeper swears by it. Yeah, there's honeybee healthy. That's a product that came on the market probably, I don't know, 9, 10 years ago or so. When it first came on the market, I thought it was this sort of foo-foo stuff that was really just to make the beekeeper feel good about themselves and that they were doing wonderful things for their beehive. I've really come around on that. I really think that Honeybee Healthy is a product that has real value and health properties for the colony. Now, we can't say that it helps with Varroa or Nosema or anything like that, because now it's a treatment. But there's some really great research that's come out on Honeybee Healthy, and some really and now the anecdotal evidence is so significant in terms of volume of it that it's really hard to ignore. And so Honeybee Healthy really has some properties, some really great properties about it that we think it's a good product to use. And a lot of beekeepers are mixing up their own, and there's some recipes online. I've never done any experiments with the recipes online versus the real product. But I would caution that finding some good essential oils, they've got to be essential oils, are imperative to making a good, healthy product for your bees. Because I've heard of people using fragrance oils, which are very, very different from essential oils. They're synthetic versus from the natural source. So be aware of that and use some caution. There's some questions here about whether all these conversations are regarding Italian bees, and no, it can be any type of European honeybee, not necessarily the Italians, but Carniolans would work just fine. Russians, sure. All of those would be perfectly fine to try some of these with. Some questions about mentoring, suggestions, resources for mentoring students. I would turn to your cooperative extension. They may have some if you've got a really active cooperative extension in beekeeping. Certainly local associations often have some teaching aids, maybe some teaching frames, some posters, things like that. Depending on your school or the system that wherever you're doing this mentoring, whether it's in this actual school or outside the school, observation hives are always a hit. It captivates their attention, and it allows for you to actually show the inside of a hive. If you're going into the actual school, the school grounds, some schools do not like to see live honeybees coming in for liability reasons, which certainly I can understand that. So you may have to improvise there by bringing in some beekeeping equipment that doesn't have the bees on it. But there's no sort of mentoring guide that I am aware of. What you might want to try, it may give you some ideas, some inspiration, but would probably be at too high a level to use sort of off the shelf. But a lot of states have master beekeeping programs that are geared towards, of course, educating new beekeepers about beekeeping and about honeybees. And again, that's going to be sort of at a higher level than school kids, but there could be some very useful things that you could employ from that program that you could sort of modify to make it age appropriate. Talk to your state association. I know North Carolina State Beekeepers, they're coming to Wilkesboro here in a few weeks, so right near where the business is located. And I've been involved in helping to organize what they call Bee Buddies, which is for 8 to 12-year-olds. And so they've got sort of a program. They're 4 20-minute sessions that these kids go through, and there are activities that so they're sort of moving about but yet learning on beekeeping and about the honeybees and the things they do. So you can check with your local association or state association to see whether they've got anything similar to that maybe they've done at fairs or workshops at schools or those along those lines. Will you post the webinar? I usually do. It usually just takes me a few days to get converted over into a format that's acceptable for YouTube, and we'll get it up there as soon as we can. Have you ever heard of adding food coloring to sugar syrup to show where the bees are storing sugar syrup as opposed to nectar? You could do that. Because bees are very good at compartmentalizing their food source, if you will. So if you've uncapped frames of honey before, you may notice that there's areas of light honey and then pockets of dark honey, and those are different nectar sources that they're foraging on, and of course keeping compartmentalized in the comb. And so if you were feeding, you would also then, they would be compartmentalizing that, compartmentalizing the sugar syrup to some extent. I guess I'm a little hesitant to sort of suggest this, because if you end up with a frame that's got 50-50, it's going to be really difficult to uncap the honey and not the sugar syrup, and you run the risk of sort of tainting your honey product. So my rule of thumb would be if I'm collecting, if my bees are putting up honey and honey supers that I'm going to harvest from, I'm not feeding at that point. So I'm not worried about that sugar syrup ending up inside my honey frames. So with that, we had a couple of nice little experiments. Oh, I'm sorry, Suzanne. So the sugar syrup colorant was more as an experiment rather than to try and separate out. Sure, yeah, that might be an interesting thing. So I apologize that I misinterpreted your question. And I'll also mention along the food coloring lines, there was an experiment done where they added blue dye to beeswax foundation. So you had this sheet of beeswax, kind of like a candle sheet. You know, if you've seen those for rolled candles, it was similar to that, but not quite as dark and striking a color. It wasn't quite so extreme, but a little bit of a blue tint to the foundation. And they put bees on the foundation. Of course, the bees began to draw comb. The bees drew the comb all the way out, and the beekeeper waited until it was capped over, and then did a section through that comb down from the top of the cell to the bottom of the cell. So not like you were uncapping honey for harvest, but rather from the capping down to the bottom of the cell. And what he found was that that blue wax, it extended out about halfway, half the length of the cell. So that means those bees were drawing that wax out halfway before they started to add their own wax that they had to produce. That's one of the reasons why at the bee farm, if you're getting started with a brand new colony, we really advocate wax foundation, because they can utilize the resource of that wax sheet to begin re-sculpting it, reforming it into drawn comb before they actually have to start consuming resources, sugar or honey or nectar, to produce wax themselves. With that, we've hit our 7 o'clock mark. We've had an interesting conversation. I hope you've found it enjoyable. It's a little bit different type of topic for us, a little less serious, a little kind of crazy and novel, and some interesting things to try. I said in the description of it that there would be one thing in here that you'd want to try. I hope I fulfilled that promise, that either the drone trapping or the sculpting of a frame or the jars on the top or some of the other things that we've discussed thereafter, hopefully there was something in there that appealed to you and you can take away and give it a go and see how it works for you. Because really it's the experimentation in beekeeping that really keeps it interesting and novel and is a real pleasure, at least for me, as I go through my beekeeping career, and I hope that you'll enjoy it too. So once you get some basic beekeeping knowledge under your belt, if you're just getting started, give one of these a go or try something different and let us know how it works. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this. Good luck. I hope the flow is just, the faucets are open for you and that the bees are just piling it in, and we're looking forward to a great honey season. And until next time, thanks, have a good time, and good luck beekeeping. Bye-bye.